This video is sponsored by Gin Rummy Stars, a friendly, fun, and free gin rummy game that you can play anywhere, anytime. You can download this game by clicking the link in the description, and you'll get 1,000 free coins. Each player starts with 10 cards. The goal is to complete the highest number of sets and runs to achieve more points than your opponent, while trying to avoid any extra cards which count as dead wood. You'll also run into special variants such as the Joker Gin, which are wild cards that can complete any set. And if you've ever wanted to play cards with a bunch of strangers while wearing a wig, I've been there myself many times. You can customize your own avatar and match wits with players from all around the world. I really enjoy how engaging this game is. It's strategic and it also has a fast pace, which I find very stimulating. I was recently stuck in an airport for 3 hours, and this game made the time fly by. No pun intended. And I kept shouting yes out loud every time I got a matching set, and everyone around me kept looking up at me. It was kind of awkward.
Do you mind? It sounds like you're having too much fun playing that Gin Rummy Stars game.
Oh, you'll be fine. Go back to reading your newspaper. Anyways, click the link in the description and download Gin Rummy Stars. And as I said earlier, I'll hook you up with 1,000 coins for free. You're welcome. Not only will you be helping out my channel, but you'll also be supporting a very good cause. Gin Rummy Stars wants to raise awareness for animal rights. During June, some of the proceeds will be donated to IFAW, which is a global non-profit organization. They rescue, rehabilitate, and release animals. They also help restore and protect their natural habitats. So download Gin Rummy Stars today, and I'll see you there. My name is Caleb Hudson. My YouTube channel is Hudson Hornet. The following is a true experience that I will never forget. For some backstory, this happened in 2015. I live in South Carolina. I've always been a fan of horror movies and being creeped out. The thrill was almost addicting to me back then. My wife would make fun of me because whenever that creepy feeling came over me, my eyes would instinctively begin to water. Being military, I've seen all the ugly and depraved things that humans are capable of, and I've never given much thought to the notion of the Native American creatures known as Skinwalkers. Having zero experience with the native tribes, and being unaware of stories surrounding these creatures, I would have never imagined that something like that could exist in my world. I have since changed my thinking on this, and I no longer have any doubt in my mind that they are out there. By sharing my experience, I hope I can open your mind and inform you that not every encounter ends with immediate death or bloodshed. Hopefully, by listening to my story, you will react correctly should you ever find yourself in the same predicament that I was in. I live in a somewhat rural area, and my house is on 2 acres of land, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. At the time, I was on mid-shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was the weekend, and I normally stayed awake at night while my family was sleeping, so I didn't have to change my sleeping habits. I was outside working on my truck, so that the house would be quiet for all those sleeping. I was listening to some music, and cursing at the stubborn bolt I was trying to remove. The area was illuminated by a set of halogen work lights. I had my head stuck into the engine bay of my truck. I can't remember what song I was listening to, but I was singing along, trying to drown out the sound of my ratchet clicking over and over as I turned loose the rusty bolt. I wasn't really paying much attention to anything else. The song faded, and there was a slight pause before the next song started. In this 1 to 2 second break, whether it was conscious or subconscious, I picked up on something. An eerie tingling feeling running down my spine. The next song abruptly started, and I quickly reached up to my phone and paused it. After the music stopped, it happened again. My body was almost vibrating, and my eyes immediately began watering up. I stopped turning the ratchet and instantly froze in place, my head still leaning over into the engine bay. I listened carefully and slowly began to realize that the world around me had gone completely silent. Being 2 to 3 a.m. in late July in the south, you would expect to hear some crickets or some random dogs barking in the distance, maybe the wind blowing through the trees. But there was absolutely no sound, nothing at all. I got the sinking feeling that I was being watched and had to force myself to calm down enough to turn around and confront whatever it could be. I raised my head and I slowly turned, gazing into the utter darkness. I sighed with relief to know that no one was behind me, but that icy feeling and the deafening silence was still there. I had to convince myself that it was all in my head, but I had to look for some type of explanation for what I was experiencing. My work lights made it impossible for me to see anything in the darkness behind them. I grabbed a smaller handheld work light from my tool bag and switched it on to scan the tree line. My eyes were hyper-focused on the beam as I scanned back and forth. I then saw it. Something was looming among the trees. My light reflected a pair of piercing yellow eyes. Startled, I froze again, unable to completely understand what I was looking at. The light in my hand was too weak to make out anything else. Without taking a step or averting my eyes off the ominous eyes, I reached my hand out to my work lights and slowly spun them around. I tried not to blink and held my breath until the beams of light landed on the bush. It revealed the dog sitting behind the bush. I let out a frustrated sigh at the thought of how stupid I was to have been frozen in fear by some random dog. Seeing random dogs in the woods or prowling around your yard is really common in the South. Collar and leash laws are lax in rural areas, meaning that dogs are free to roam at their will. I called out to it, whistling and gesturing for it to go away. The dog didn't move. Confused, my eyes focused on the dog's details. That was when I noticed it's of normal size. It was huge. Sitting behind the bush, I knew that it was at least 4 feet tall. It was tall enough for me to see its head, neck, and most of its chest. It was sporting a coat of what looked like a German shepherd, with some sort of skin irritation. Its large yellow eyes were haunting, and are now burned into my memory. I slowly began to realize that this wasn't a normal dog. Its face and body looked off. It's hard to explain, but it was like its skin didn't quite line up, like it was distorted in some way. My mind raced, staring into the creature's eyes, not knowing what it could be. My blood turned to ice after realizing how long I had been standing there. It must have been 5 to 10 minutes, and this thing hadn't moved an inch. It never even took a breath. I never saw its tail. To be honest, I don't even know if there was one. My mind spun as my heart rate elevated and my skin began to crawl. I thought that if this thing was going to charge at me, I could do nothing other than scream as it tore me to pieces. I knew that no one was around me, and no one would know what happened to me or what terror I experienced in my last moments. Trying desperately to gather myself, I thought that if I didn't take my eyes off of it, then it wouldn't move. Now I know that this might sound stupid, however I do think that this was the correct course of action. I couldn't take it any longer. I stepped backward, half expecting it to attack me in response. But it didn't. I took another step back as my legs shook uncontrollably, never breaking eye contact. I walked backward until my back literally hit the house. I slid against the side until I got to the door. I slowly grabbed the handle behind my back, backed into the house, then slammed the door shut, locking the handle and deadbolt. I flipped on the light, feeling safe, like when you were a kid and you pulled the covers over your head. I then broke into a million pieces, bursting into tears and sliding down the door, my head falling into my lap. I thanked my lucky stars for not panicking, taking deep breaths and trying to gather myself. From outside, I heard an unearthly, blood-chilling scream. I ran to every door and window in my house, ensuring that everything was shut and locked. My mind was at its breaking point, and I could no longer process anything. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the living room away from the windows, with every light on. I now know that what I saw in the forest that night was a Skinwalker. There's no doubt in my mind. I told my wife and my close friend what happened, but I've read that just by talking about them to people you know creates an atmosphere of fear, which will draw them in, so I don't mention or discuss it anymore. It's been years since that night, but every time I go outside after sunset, I can't help but scan the tree line with my flashlight, ever vigilant, but hoping that I never see that thing again. I still live in that same house to this day. If you take nothing else away from my story, know this. 1. Without a doubt, there are things out there that we humans do not understand. And 2, always trust your gut instinct when it tells you that danger is near. And 3, if you see them, stay calm. Do not speak. Breathe slowly. Carefully back away. And never take your eyes off of it. I grew up in a small coal mining town in Kentucky. During the early 90s, the town fell in hard times when the coal mine shut down. The coal mine was what kept this town running, and after it closed, a lot of people that lived there moved away, leaving entire blocks of vacant, empty houses. By the late 90s, the place had become a ghost town. My family, along with a handful of others, were the only ones left. My best friend Randy and I used to love going around the empty houses and messing around. We couldn't have been no older than 11 years old at the time. We used to play manhunt in this one house that sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. This particular place had been empty even before the coal mine shut down. And after doing some research as an adult, I discovered that it had been ravaged by fire in 1978, which killed the old man who used to live there. We picked this house because it stood out like a sore thumb among the other homes in the abandoned neighborhood. It was the only two-story on the block, and it had a rotten look to it, with one side entirely charred by fire damage. Its creepy appearance is why we chose to play inside of it. We didn't really think about the potential danger of falling through decaying floorboards or breathing in the toxic mold that undoubtedly clung to its foundation. Being the clever kids we were, we dubbed it the Haunted Mansion. One day, Randy and I rode our bikes down to the Haunted Mansion for a game of manhunt. We wanted our mutual friend Kyle to join us, but his mom was being a real bitch that day, so he couldn't make it. We soon pulled up to the house, hid our bikes in some bushes, and then went inside. Since Randy had been the hider last time, it was my turn to be the hider. So he waited by the front door and counted to 100, while I went to go find a hiding spot. I chose to hide in the basement. The basement was a very dark area that reeked of mildew and rotten wood. It wasn't exactly off limits, but we never picked it as a hiding place because of the smell. But I wanted to give Randy a run for his money that day. The basement was completely underground. It had no windows. The only light that came in was through the open doorway at the top of the stairs. At some point, the door had been removed off its hinges, so I simply walked through the open doorway and descended the steps into the dark basement. The only thing I could see was an old lopsided desk directly in front of the landing, so I decided that I would hide under it. Fortunately, there were several holes in the desk that I could see out of, so I could keep an eye on the staircase. After about 30 minutes of waiting in the dark, I heard someone shuffling around on the floor above me, before a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. I couldn't see too well from my hiding spot, but the figure appeared to be way too tall to be Randy. The person just stood there. The only thing I can seem to remember about them was that they appeared to be wearing a long, hooded jacket. The silhouette eventually began to descend the wooden steps. This next part is hard for me to relay, because I'm not sure how to put it into words exactly. The figure seemed to transform as it made its way down the steps. It went from looking like a man to an enormous spider with several elongated legs sprouting from its body. Tears rolled down my face as I covered my mouth to muffle the uncontrolled sobs as I stared at the horrifying shape that was now only a few feet away from the desk. It looked like something straight out of a nightmare. The spider thing stared at the desk before it pivoted and disappeared into the dark basement. As soon as it vanished from sight, I pissed myself. That's not a figure of speech either. I literally pissed myself, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. After about 5 minutes of sitting in the darkness, something happened that I'll never forget. From somewhere inside the dark basement, a hoarse voice spoke to me.
"Please leave my home, young man."
I ran out of there as fast as I could. Within seconds, I exited the front door to see Randy on his bike, smirking at me. "Ha! I knew you were down in the basement. No way was I going down there so you could jump out and scare me. Hey, did you piss yourself?" I didn't say a word to him. I just grabbed my bike and sped off, with Randy following behind me, making jokes about the wet stain on my pants. When we got back to my house, I tried to explain everything that happened. He didn't believe a word of it, of course, and was still making fun of me for pissing my pants. For all these years, I thought that this was just all in my head. Perhaps I dozed off underneath that desk and had a bad dream. This was until I heard a series of stories on this channel about something called the Longlegs Monster. In almost every story, it first appears as a hooded man, then takes the form of a giant spider-like creature. The sightings have mostly taken place in the northeast United States. I'm not entirely sure if what I encountered was the same creature, but the similarities are hard to ignore. This event took place a couple of years ago, and is downright the most horrific experience of my life. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is George. At the time of this story, I was 23 years old. I would go camping deep in the woods with my 3 friends, Jasmine, Richard, and Robert, who were all around the same age as me. The 4 of us met in high school, and were avid campers. We all considered it living life to the fullest. There was a large forest near Jasmine's neighborhood where we usually went camping. Normally, we would use a dirt trail until we found a big enough clearing so we could smoke, drink, and basically have a good time. However, this time we decided to change things up. We would go deeper into the woods than we had ever gone before, just for the hell of it. We left the truck at the beginning of the trail and began our hike. Eventually, we came upon a clearing. After about 20 minutes, we got the tent set up, busted out the coolers, and got the party going. I've always had a crush on Jasmine, so Richard and Robert were doing their best to give us some alone time. Since Robert was into hunting, he would use the excuse to go off and tinker with his rifle about 30 feet away from the fire. While he was doing that, Richard said, "I think I'll go get some more firewood." He grabbed his flashlight and gave me a subtle wink before he set off into the forest, leaving me with Jasmine. All was going well. Jasmine and I were flirting with each other for maybe about 10 minutes or so. when we heard this flapping above us.
What the hell was that?
Don't worry, it was probably a hawk or something.
Are you sure? That sounded way too big to be a hawk.
I'm sure it's fine. Robert says that large birds are common around these parts. After explaining this to Jasmine, she calmed down. This was short-lived, however. When the three of us heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the forest in the direction that Richard ventured off to. Robert and I jumped up, while Jasmine let out a small yelp. Robert quickly loaded his gun, and then tossed me a baseball bat. We told Jasmine to return to the truck, and the two of us then sprinted toward where we heard the scream. We slowed our pace when we saw shreds of Richard's blue shirt, which were now stained by fresh blood. We continued forward quietly, Robert leading with his rifle, and me following behind with the bat ready. After a couple of minutes, we started to hear a repulsive chomping sound, like someone was tearing into a piece of meat. We had our flashlights pointed in front of us, but saw nothing. As we continued, the sound became louder and louder. I then realized the sound wasn't in front of us. It was above us. Robert and I looked at each other. The same thing had also occurred to him. He slowly aimed his light upward, and I nearly pissed myself at what the beam of light revealed. What looked like the biggest owl I had ever seen, standing at least 6 feet tall, was perched on a branch. Its feathers appeared to be gray and black in color. It had large talons wrapping around the thick branch it was on. Immediately after Robert illuminated the creature, it spun around. We then realized two things. This thing was not an owl, at least not completely. Its face was almost human-like. It was covered in smooth feathers and had pointed ears with a pair of massive eyes. Its nose was a strange amalgamation between a beak and a human nose, with a regular mouth underneath. In other words, it appeared to be a hybrid between a man and an owl. The second thing we noticed was that its mouth was covered in blood. Richard's blood. The giant owl then revealed another set of hand-like talons attached to arms above its wings. One of them was holding intestines. What was left of Richard's body was behind it. This thing glared at us with its piercing eyes. Robert was so awestruck that he didn't even raise his rifle. He was completely paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, it suddenly dropped the intestines, which landed with a splat. It then opened its massive wingspan and swooped down at us. Robert and I instinctively ducked down. "Shit! Go! Go!" Robert shouted. We didn't waste any time. We hauled ass back to the truck, all while hearing the flapping of giant wings above us. Once we got there, we quickly got in and floored it out of there, leaving our stuff behind.
What is it? What's wrong? Wait, where's Richard?
He's gone.
What do you mean he's gone? What happened to him?
Robert and I stayed silent. We called the police as soon as we got back home. We told them that Richard was attacked by an animal, nothing more. We led the officers back to where we found what was left of Richard, still in the tree. Richard's lower torso was gone, while the rest of him was a mangled, bloody mess. Robert and a few of the cops threw up at the gruesome sight. I was somehow able to hold it together, but I silently wept for Richard. There was an investigation that ultimately concluded that Richard was the victim of a mountain lion attack. Robert and I haven't talked much about what happened that night ever since, The three of us still hang out, but it hasn't been the same without Richard. Despite what happened, Jasmine and I still got together, and we've been a couple for a few years now. I still never told her what actually happened, for fear of scaring her, or her not believing me. I conducted my own research based on what I saw. I think what we encountered that night was a creature known as the Owl Man. Until now, Robert and I were the only ones who knew what actually happened to Richard. But every night since then, I still find myself asking, will it come for me next?